My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by another ETSU alum, Aaron Cunanan. How are you doing, Aaron?
Doing well, Josh. Thanks for having me back on. It's good to see you again and to reconnect.
Yeah. Eventually this will be in person and it'll feel
Yeah.
much more comfortable and natural. But it's always a pleasure. And in the previous podcasts we've done them on readiness testing and periodization, biomechanics of weightlifting. And we've kind of spanned a bunch of different topics and a bunch of different concepts, all within the realm or the bubble of sports science. I think the thing that you've done differently and really uniquely, and I think people who are listening to the podcast can gain a lot of insight from it, is taken the skill set developed from weightlifting as a sport, from sports science as like an academic pursuit, from like a researcher perspective and then a practitioner perspective in an academic setting, and then turn that into someone who in a professional organization like the Reds or the Giants or the UFC can then use those skill sets to answer certain questions or provide assistance to people who need data on readiness or performance, or as we kind of mentioned before we started talking, like descriptive aspects of where people are at, where they should be, where they're going. So thought it'd be a fun chat to dig into. And I thought the best place to start is actually something I don't know about you, is before you were at LSU Shreveport, what were your interests? What were you doing before you met Dr. Pierce?
Man, that's a long time ago. But it was not weightlifting. It wasn't even like performance related. I started undergrad as an English education major. I wanted to teach high school English. So I went through most of my undergrad with that as a goal. Had some different experiences that got me more interested on the education policy side of things. So I kind of pivoted, and my goal was to get into education policy, go to law school, end up at a think tank working on education policy. And then I found weightlifting kind of by accident. I went to a pretty big high school in Indiana, just outside of Indianapolis, and I was small growing up. I was like 120 pounds, 5'6", as a freshman, and 120 pounds and 5'6" as a senior graduating from high school. We had over 4,000 kids in our school, so we were pretty competitive in most of our sports. Luckily, we had a club rugby team that kind of all of the misfits and people that weren't on any of the varsity teams. A lot of them ended up there. I was decently fast and was always strong, quote unquote, for my size, which had I had weightlifting or strength and conditioning back then, may have been a much better athlete. But long story short, the way I got into weightlifting was I had a pretty bad ankle injury from rugby, and as I was getting back from that, just was reading more and more about resistance training. CrossFit was starting to pop up around that time, so I was seeing a lot more videos online, and then just kept reading and watching videos on weightlifting and how it's great for improving explosiveness and power and all this sort of stuff. So that piqued my interest, and I started weight training on my own at the gym on campus. Terribly, didn't have a coach, had terrible videos to watch on YouTube as a model, but that's how I got started in weightlifting, believe it or not. And then I ended up moving back to Indianapolis for a little bit of time, kind of transitioning in school, and found this gym, Indianapolis Fitness and Sports Training, which is owned by Mike Robertson and Bill Hartman. And like they had just opened up when I moved down there, and they had a big powerlifting crew. So there are people getting ready for competitions all the time, super strong guys. Um, it was a pretty cool environment from a training standpoint, and being the like competitive atmosphere that it was, like they encouraged me to find a local weightlifting meet and try it out. So I found a meet in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is funny to think. Like I just realized that now. Um, so I went there and did my first meet. Had no idea what I was doing. Like had no idea about like weigh-ins and warm ups and attempt changes and anything like that. But one of the referees there, Mark Garrett, he's a strength coach at Crown Point,
Mm.
Indiana. Um, he was reffing the meet. He saw me compete. We were talking a little bit, and I guess I was looked like I could be explosive. And he was like, "Hey, do you have a coach?" Just trying to get to know me a little bit. Told him I didn't have one really, and he put me in touch with a gentleman named Rufus Blackbone. His real name is Grant Gardis. He was a coach out of Indiana or Indianapolis, and he put me in touch with him, and that's how I started training. He was my first weightlifting coach, and like I said, it was at a point where I was kind of taking a little bit of a break from school, trying to like figure out what the next step was, and was getting into weightlifting with Rufus. And he was like, "Hey, my good buddy Kyle Pierce, he's got a program down in Shreveport, Louisiana. He got some talent in weightlifting. If you want to, pursue it and compete, why don't you move down there? You can go to school. It's cheap. They offer some scholarships." So that was, I think, spring of 2009 when I met up with Rufus. And then fall of 2009, I was driving my white Honda Civic down to Shreveport, Louisiana to train and compete with Kyle. Yeah, so that was the journey down to Shreveport. Yeah, kind of a just haphazard tale of different events that led me down there.
Yeah, and the only reason I know who Rufus is and shout out to Kyle and Mandy from Ran Academy for Strength and Speed, is because they mention him all the time and the stories he has and his involvement with the sport. So a lot of the names you're mentioning are familiar just because I kind of know a little bit about Indiana weightlifting and I've been in that space. So it's really funny to hear it connected, especially to you, who then is like got connected to Dr. Pierce and Doc Stone, and yeah, it seems like everyone
Yeah,
knows everyone at some point. But
yeah. I think that's been my journey has definitely been one of those where you just benefit from people's networks, different
yeah,
connections. Like if it weren't for Mark Garrett talking to me after that meet, never would have met Rufus and never would have gone down to be with Kyle. And Kyle was one of Doc Stone's first PhD students back in the day, so never would have, had the ETSU connection. And yeah, life has a funny way of working out sometimes.
it does, and that's one thing I wanted to kind of talk about. When you did move down there, you mentioned being an English major. How'd you decide to transition into something more sport related? I don't know exactly what the degree is there, but you're working with a weightlifting team, you're working with Dr. Pierce, so it had to be something more like sport performance related.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, so when I moved down there, I was still the plan was still to pursue the education policy route. So I was going to finish up my undergrad, plan to still apply to law schools and go that route. So like I said, that was fall 2009. Then focusing on training, finished up my undergrad that next summer, and was just really enjoying training, making good progress. Was just in a situation where like I didn't have the pressure of time to like get out and go on to the next thing academically. So I just kind of focused on weightlifting a little bit, and like we had a freaking crew down there. It was just a really cool time to be a part of that gym. I would love to be a part of it now. It's such a cool place. But we had so many amazing lifters. Like the training environment was incredible. We had so many different international teams coming, throughout the year to train there. And so as I continued to focus on weightlifting, the program actually started out as a youth development program. And so that still to this day, there are middle school kids and high school kids that come in from around Shreveport and the surrounding area to train at the facility. And so just naturally started to, offer words of advice to some of the newcomers, and Kyle, if he was working with somebody or if he had to go teach a class, and there's several of us in there, he'd like say, hey, can you help out so and so with this? They're working on this progression. And so we would take them through their workout. And that's how I got the first introduction to like quote unquote coaching, just kind of helping out with the kids and making sure that they got through their workout safely, and just offering words of advice and encouragement and all that sort of stuff. And then when we would travel to meets, whether that was collegiate nationals or senior nationals or juniors or whatever, like I said, we had a crew. So we had lifters in like almost all the weight classes, men and women, and we needed a lot of help in the back room with loading weights and stuff. So started helping out at the meets in terms of loading and learning how to count cards and all that sort of stuff, or count attempts. And then, that kind of evolved into, having responsibility over, some of the lifters during the meets. As we lifted and trained together in the gym, there are a bunch of us that would train around the same time, and we would just offer, advice to each other, hey, can you give me some feedback on this lift, or can you watch my lifts today? And so that was kind of the next step to developing as a coach, is just learning how to provide feedback or how to develop your eye. It was a very like low pressure environment, and I had the self-awareness to know that I wasn't a coach, or I wouldn't have called myself a coach then. So I like was very mindful to not overstep any boundaries or offer advice where it wasn't asked for or anything like that. Just kind of sit back and absorb and listen. And responsibility just kind of grew naturally and organically. I got to have a little bit more autonomy in terms of coaching specific athletes in the gym, or taking responsibility for different lifters at different meets. One of my most memorable experience from a coaching standpoint was coaching Kendrick. I think it was at the World Trials in 2015, or maybe it was the Pan Am Trials for 2015. And it was just me there coaching him by myself. And it was one of those, like, he had to make it. He had to qualify for the team in order to remain eligible for the 2016 games, based off of whatever the qualification criteria were at the time. And that was like one of the most stressful moments of my career. Like, even to this day, it's probably the most stressful situation or environment that I've been in, because if I mess up counting, or mistime his attempts, or make a bad call on how much we go up on an attempt, and he doesn't make it, and like just the pressure was so high, and I was like just sitting there trying to like tell myself to be cool and like not convey any sense of panic or anything to Kendrick, and fortunately he did end up qualifying. I think he probably would have done it no matter who was back there with them. But it was cool, a few months later, talking to Kyle, just kind of debriefing on the year and everything. And he mentioned that, after that qualifying event, Kendrick and him were talking and catching up and whatnot. And Kendrick, told Kyle that, that I did a good job and that like I was calm and, just was the right presence for him there. So that was good validation, like that I made it through and performed how I wanted to for him. Um, so yeah, that was, I guess, the early stages of developing as a coach, kind of like I said, just started organically, and just grew in responsibility and scope. And as I started to like envision that coaching could be a possibility, and like just really found a passion for it, I think naturally was drawn to coaching because of the similarities to teaching. Like for me, the motivation was like trying to help others realize their potential. And like I think that is the same across both professions, teaching and coaching. Um, I think one of the critical pieces of my development as a coach and practitioner was Kyle's involvement with the International Weightlifting Federation and the Pan Am Weightlifting Federation. He was part of their scientific and research committee and their coaching committees. So he was traveling around the world all the time, giving courses or, just working on different things with coaches and programs around the world. Kyle himself, I think at the time, aside from like Northern Michigan University, the training center in Colorado Springs, probably one of the few places that had like a systematic, like typical Olympic program type of approach to training. And so just getting to see that firsthand, what that looked like he had trained Kendrick since just after the 96 games when the facility just opened. Like he was his coach for, all of the almost 20 years of Kendrick's career, plus everybody else that was there. So from a like long-term athlete development, from a systematic approach to training standpoint, from an education standpoint, from a like appreciation of scientific literature and scientific rationale and basis for training, was very influential. Like that was what I came up in. And so that definitely got me more interested, when I'm sitting there as a young coach, like trying to envision what's my goal. Like I wanted to be the next Kyle Pierce. Like I wanted to be the next great American weightlifting coach and like develop my own program and my own athletes and have the same sort of success that he had and it still has to this day. And I recognize like the education component was a big piece of that. So they had a master's program at LSUS in kinesiology and health, or kinesiology and wellness or something like that. So got my master's degree, got to dive in more on the physiology, which was, that was pretty tough coming from a soft science. So once I made the transition from wanting to be an English teacher to like the education policy, I switched undergrad majors to sociology. So my undergrad was actually in sociology. So again, soft science, and as far as like scientific rigor or like diving into some of the basic sciences like biology and physics and things like that, didn't really have that as part of my background. So it was definitely challenging early on for the master's program, but just bared down and dug in, and like to think that my physiology knowledge is pretty decent these days. So went through that master's program, and again, just continuing to develop as a coach, like, and somebody that wants to use sports science, whether that's relying on scientific literature to, inform your training decisions, whether that's trying to be systematic in how you program and track, the training and outcomes, whether that's trying to use technology to analyze technique and evaluate your lifters and, measure different changes that you're trying to work on with a specific lifter. I just started to run into walls where like my skills weren't, I kind of ran into the limit of where my skills would take me, ran into the limit of what questions I could answer from the existing research and literature. And a PhD had always been like kind of on the roadmap, knowing like, in Kyle's background, all of the international programs that are coached by people with PhDs in performance or PhDs in weightlifting, even if you're in one of the former Soviet countries. So I knew that that was important for me, and ETSU was just a natural fit given kind of the pedigree of the faculty there. Uh, at the time, they were designated as an Olympic training site for weightlifting, so strong ties to USA Weightlifting and the USOC. They still have a weightlifting program, just not with the training site designation. Um, so yeah, it was a natural fit. Like I mentioned earlier, Kyle was one of Doc's first PhD students back in the day. Had a good relationship with Doc Stone. Had run into the Satoshi Mizuguchi, who's a head weightlifting coach for ETSU's program. Had run into him and their athletes several times at meets and whatnot. One of our lifters, Tim McInnes, actually went up in 2011, I believe, when they first started their weightlifting program to help get it off the ground and up and running. Um, so yeah, just strong ties there, and was able to step in and feel a need for some coaching and sports science stuff there. So yeah, I guess I'll stop talking there. I'm sure there's a lot to unpack. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of drive the discussion wherever you want.
Sure. No, and I think that was a great detailing of how you essentially went from being someone who wanted to go into an entirely different field and then pivoted completely based on experience in strength sports and weightlifting into getting a graduate degree and then a PhD. And we recorded a few podcasts, again, one on block periodization and then one on the biomechanics of weightlifting. And I think we really deep dive into a lot of the research you did during your time at ETSU. So I don't think we'll get into that too much, but I did want to talk quite extensively about your decisions after you graduated, why you or why you didn't go into academia or stay in academia, teaching and researching. And then once you kind of got more into the professional world, how you took all of those skills that you developed through your time at LSU Shreveport, ETSU, and then turn that into something where you could go to a UFC Performance Institute and apply what you knew from kind of different, a completely different sport. Weightlifting is not at all close to mixed martial arts, but take those skills, and as you call yourself, you're a bit of a generalist. So you take those kind of generalist qualities and apply those to a specific setting. So maybe first we tackle that idea of like, why not academia? Why not research full time?
Yeah, I think for me, being involved in academia was always rooted first and foremost, from my experience and perspective of being a practitioner. Like I pursued the education because I wanted to be a better practitioner. And I was in Shreveport from 2009 and then moved to Johnson City for the PhD in 2016. So 7 years down in Louisiana, again, focusing on weightlifting first as an athlete and then as a coach and going through the master's program there. Um, so like I said, I spent a lot of time developing and focusing specifically on being a coach. And my involvement in academia or my involvement with the research was always to answer questions that I had as a coach or that I thought would be valuable as a coach. And so going to ETSU for the PhD, even though you have pretty intensive coursework, diving into physiology and biomechanics and stats and nutrition and all that sort of stuff, you get just as much, if not more, intensive experience on the practitioner side of things, which to me was like that was really important in pursuing a PhD. And especially at the time, what I think was unique about ETSU's educational model, they were the only, university or program in the U.S. at the time to operate that way. So, like I said, I got to come in and be an assistant coach for the weightlifting program, and at the same time be involved with their sports science and monitoring program, focusing on weightlifting. Um, and so I guess kind of the evolution, like I said earlier, early on when I was kind of envisioning what I wanted to, what kind of career I wanted to try to carve out, it was, like I said, trying to be the next Kyle Pierce, wanted to be the next great American weightlifting coach. And through my involvement with, you know, different Olympic sports or Olympic athletes that would come and train with us, or that, we'd have the opportunity to have conversations with at LSUS, um, through my involvement in just like being around, different USOC programs and other Olympic committees, and programs internationally, I just gained a better or more of an appreciation for, um, life outside of
Mm.
S&C or physical preparation. I just became more aware of like what holistic training entails, all the different elements from sport med to nutrition to sports psych, um, all of those different elements and how those things come together to, develop athletes. And that just naturally grabbed my curiosity, and kind of expanded what I was um, what I was interested in developing, from a like a skill standpoint, and wanting to be able to, um, not be a dietitian or be a physical therapist or be a sports psychologist, but being able to help navigate like how all of those things come together for the training and preparation of an athlete. And so that kind of shifted my, interest more toward these general, whether it's a sports science type role or high performance manager, high performance director type role, where you are more involved, with all of the different elements that are part of, preparing an athlete, and how those practitioners and elements come together in terms of athlete support. So that was very much like happening during that transition right toward the tail end of me being in Shreveport and going to ETSU. So getting to develop those sports scientist skills at ETSU, with running the monitoring program for our weightlifters, that was something that I think that's one of the most beneficial, like practical experiences that I was able to gain. Um, Given that, like you mentioned, some of the differences between weightlifting and the UFC, like weightlifting, I guess one of the similarities is you have a limited number of competitions throughout the year. With weightlifting, the dates are fixed relative, like pretty firmly. Um, so your timeline is well in advance. You can plan very clearly, like from a periodization and programming standpoint, like what you're going to be working on when. Um, but with that said, like being at ETSU, we follow like a block periodization model. And so our training blocks lasting 3 to 5 or 6 weeks. We tested our athletes after every training block. Whereas any of the other sports that we worked with at ETSU are your team sports, your Olympic sports, volleyball, soccer, basketball, that sort of stuff. So they're testing maybe at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester. So 2 times a semester, whereas we were literally training or literally testing every week, I would
Mm.
say, is, given that our lifters were all training for different competitions and they're not exactly on the same training schedule. So I had the opportunity to run like a longitudinal athlete monitoring program and get a lot of hands-on with, testing and, turning that information around and using it to understand the training process, what's happening with our athletes. And so during this time, just continually evolving what my interests were or what types of roles I felt like I would want to go after that would be interesting to me. Um, as much as I love weightlifting, like there aren't that many, you know, high performance director jobs in weightlifting. Outside of the USOPC headquarters in Colorado Springs, um, developing your own weightlifting like program and gym. Like I'm not very business savvy or inclined. Like that's not something that I'm passionate about, like growing a business. And this is a time, between 2009 and on where like online training is becoming more and more popular, like remote training is just becoming more and more popular. So like the landscape for becoming or developing like a great weightlifting program was just different than what it could have potentially been when I first started out. So I kind of recognized the writing on the wall in terms of there's probably not a lot of viable opportunities um, that I was interested in pursuing in terms of staying with weightlifting. So I became more interested in like Olympic sports and, using my time and, the environment with the training site for weightlifting. We also had a designation for bobsled skeleton. So like still plugged into like the USOC world and all of the different NGBs that we got the opportunity to interact with. But even expanding out under that umbrella, again, high performance director jobs or high performance manager jobs are few and far between. And so just was looking for ways to try to diversify myself, knowing that weightlifting is very different from the UFC. It's very different from any team sport or most team sports. And up until that point, like all of my experience had been with weightlifting, since 2009, since when I would say I was a coach, 2011, like everything had been weightlifting. And so I recognized the importance of if I was going to try to branch out and make myself a viable candidate for opportunities outside of weightlifting, would probably need to be able to demonstrate my ability to operate outside of weightlifting. Um, and so during the PhD, I think this is probably going into my second year of the PhD, I had the opportunity or the space in like my coursework in my program to be able to do uh, any coursework remotely. And so like if I was gonna go outside of ETSU to diversify myself, like now is the time to do it. And the UFC Performance Institute had opened in 2017, which like first reading about the facility that they had built, like state of the art, incredible. And then, in the weeks and months afterward, seeing who they hired to bring in and run the place. So they, brought in Duncan French as their VP of performance. Bo Sandoval was their director of strength and conditioning. And Bo had spent a long time at the USOC working with various sports, weightlifting included, was at University of Michigan prior to that. So I knew of Bo, kind of ran in similar circles or adjacent circles. And it was just an incredible opportunity to learn from two people that I really wanted to learn from and be mentored by. And like you mentioned earlier, like just an opportunity to try to apply myself in a completely different environment. And was fortunate to be able to get that internship. And I think um, that was the first like step toward, I think, the trajectory that my career had taken since, that opportunity to be able to go out there, like I said, be mentored by those people and work with the other staff at the Performance Institute to apply myself in that type of environment. Um, I think really it was exciting for me because it was a challenge of like, all right, buddy, like all you know is weightlifting. Well, that's not gonna fly here. You gotta do better than that. So it was really like a do or die moment in terms of like, can you do it? And was fortunate to have navigated it. it successfully.
Yeah. So what was that like? What was that experience like? Because so I on a previous episode, and I'll and direct people there. Spoke with Dylan Suarez, who also went to the UFCPI and did an internship, did two internships there, 2 3 month internships, and kind of talked about his experience and what he learned, what skill set he had going in, and then what he picked up along the way. For you, what was that like too, being a second year doc student, and then taking on that internship in a completely different space, in a completely different place, with a lot of room to grow, but also kind of a room to plug yourself in and test what you had developed and learned over the preceding amount of time at ETSU and LSUS.
Yeah, I think from a S&C practitioner standpoint, like obviously it was completely different environment, scenarios that you're working with. So I went in with an open mind of just trying to understand the sport and how it is different, how it's similar also, and just trying to think critically about, you know, what applies and what doesn't from a, training theory standpoint, from a training practice standpoint. Um, what is the problem set that you're trying to solve there versus anything that I'd encountered until then. One of the ways that I think I really tried to add value during my internship was, bringing the different sports science skills that I had from a testing and monitoring standpoint. Um, and this is something that I've run into everywhere I've been. Like testing athletes takes time. It eats up your bandwidth as a coach. And so I tried to, find ways to offload those sorts of things for Bo and for the other coaches that were there. So whether that was like streamlining the data collection form or just like helping to, you know, run the ISO tester, the jump testing, like they're incredible practitioners and had a lot of experience, but they were open to learning as well. And I think, from a like incorporating the isometric mid thigh pull into their testing protocol, like we had open conversations around like what that would look like or what that should look like, and like cleaning up positioning and administration of the test and all that sort of stuff. Um, and so it was, even though it was an S&C internship, like I still tried, probably selfishly, to find ways to also develop on the sports science side of things. But I, recognized that it was an S&C specific internship, so I was still at that point in my career, like thinking about next steps from the PhD, targeting or looking to target those like hybrid S&C / sports scientist roles, which were those were probably the most common types of sports science related roles that you would see come up. And there's certainly more common now, like, organizations across all the major leagues, most have like a S&C or a rehab S&C / sports science role. So those were kind of the roles that I was trying to prepare myself for. Um, and again, was fortunate to be in an opportunity that allowed me to um, kind of develop those things. Um, and yeah, I think it just gave me even more appreciation again for the multifaceted nature of like athlete development and support. Um, they're some of the best to do it over there at the UFC. Just an incredible model, and just a lot of things contribute to their success. But the practitioners being open to it, I think, is a lot of it. Um, so definitely gained uh, a really good like firsthand view of like what that looks like in operation, when things function well, when people are aligned to that sort of thing, and that kind of, I guess, shaped a lot of like my current training or philosophies and vision as far as like what performance support looks like or what athlete support looks like. Approaches to training and like what high performance models are or could be, which again continue to evolve, but the roles that I've been able to transition to, like moving me more and more closer to like helping to realize or actualize some of those thoughts.
Yeah, and then eventually you ended up uh, getting brought on as an actual like full time staff member who was responsible for. Well, I'll let you talk about what you're responsible for, but eventually got brought on full time. And I actually remember, I think we zoomed at one point, and you had like one of the fight posters on the wall, and that must have been really cool. So maybe you can even talk about your experience going from internship during the PhD program to graduating, taking a job, what that was like, what you developed kind of along the way that helped you transition into baseball, and then we'll get into your current role.
Yeah, so after that internship, it was such an incredible experience. I think like I was really trying to lobby um, Duncan and Bo to like find a way to try to like turn my internship into a full-time role. I think they're trying, having conversations. Nothing ever materialized, which that's fine. Uh, Things have worked out really well since. But went back and finished the PhD program and was looking at roles coming out of that. And was very fortunate to land the first role with the San Francisco Giants as their sports science coordinator. Um, Again, I think it was one of those just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right opportunity that came up, the right people involved in the conversation. And then that was 2020 when I was in that role with the Giants, which was the year of the COVID pandemic, which maybe we're still in pandemic. I'm not sure. But needless to say, that experience was very positive. Like I had a great experience with the Giants, a great organization to work for, and very open to what I brought to the table, and in terms of collaboration with all of the different areas of the health and performance staff there. Um, Due to a lot of different circumstances from COVID and whatnot, the role at the UFC actually came open toward the end of 2020, and the role was performance support manager, and it was really like a pretty diverse role. It was a new role that they were putting together to try to just coordinate all of the different elements of training and support that they offered for their athletes. So, like I said, that role came open at the end of 2020. Reconnected with Duncan, and it was just a great fit to be able to come back, like you said, in a full time role. Um, and like the crux of the role was, like I said, to try to coordinate all of the different elements of support that the UFC offered for their athletes. If you imagine a roster of 600 plus athletes at any given time, a few dozen that actually live in Las Vegas full time, which means that most of the athletes that they interact with are on a like pretty irregular basis in terms of being on site. And so they're constantly having new athletes come in, or athletes come in every, a few times a year. And so they're constantly having athletes come in on these irregular schedules, while on a day-to-day basis, they're having to work with these athletes, in the clinic or in the weight room or from a nutrition standpoint. So like their daily cadence is just so chaotic. And I think this should hold true in any like environment where you're working with athletes. Like your provision of care to the athlete should be like the first and foremost responsibility that you have to focus on. And that's something that those folks did tirelessly of just trying to, work with the athletes day to day to day. And so the focus of my role was to basically offload like the collation of the data and, you know, individual plans that each practitioner had, and to collate them into a comprehensive and cohesive plan for the athlete. And so it really helped to kind of drive that interdisciplinary communication around what our athlete care plan for each person was. Um, so really got to be involved in some fun and interesting conversations with the practitioners that we had, with anybody from the athletes like personal team that they wanted involved, with their coaches as well. Like if we're getting a fighter ready for a specific matchup coming up, like a lot of times we would do testing and get all of the stakeholders in the room, including their coach, and kind of talk through what the results meant and like what the plan was from an S&C standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint, from a medical maintenance and recovery standpoint. And then it was also our opportunity to understand from the coaching and fighters point of view, like what was important to them to be able to focus on, like what was their game plan going into the fight, so that we could tailor our support to help as much as possible to facilitate that. And so that was kind of my role, like I said, of just coordinating that dialogue between all of the different stakeholders. Um, and it's just a cool, fun environment, cool population to work with, just top level practitioners, um, just seeing the model and, approach, from Duncan's standpoint, as far as like what he was trying um, to help push and, develop in the world of like high performance support. Um, yeah, it was really cool to be part of that.
Yeah. What are there any examples of kind of what sticks out in terms of testing, in terms of like what the athletes tended to use, what coordinating that looked like? Because I think as a fan of the sport currently, someone hoping one day to potentially intern with them, you see the videos from Anatomy of a Fighter, you see the videos from the UFC where it's kind of the camp lead up. So you see them training, you see some of the nutrition stuff, and then you eventually see them fight. But you don't really get that more granular, detailed picture of potential testing, those coordinated meetings that allow them to reassess and make decisions about how is the training going, how's the preparation going, are we where we want to be, or what could we do better, and then making the decisions to go ahead with that. So what were some of the inside looks at like those processes with the fighters?
I'd say like one of the most important pieces to the puzzle, being a weight class sport, was on the nutrition side of things, from a body composition standpoint, from a weight management, both long term weight management and like acute fight week, like final weight cut standpoint, um, from a fueling standpoint for all of the different training activities that somebody is doing throughout the day. Um, that on top of the body weight component, like just is a unique aspect. I think from a sport medicine standpoint, like recovery and maintenance, is a huge element to that. So understanding like range of motion, um, or movement limitations or abilities, how that changes with different types of discipline, um, how to be proactive about maintaining an individual's ability to move
Mm.
well, within the octagon. And then from the physical testing standpoint, like a lot of that is used to just establish like, all right, this is, and I think this holds for most sports, like just because you have this peak force value on an isometric test, or because you have this RSI mod value from the counter movement jump, like that doesn't mean you're good, bad, or whatever in terms of your ability to perform in that specific sport. And so really like that information on the S&C side is just used to drive the programming of like auditing your training process of like,
Mm.
hey, this is where you are. We have this much time for the fight. Like this is like what our phases are going to be, or this is what we're going to focus on here. It just kind of allows you to prioritize like what's important to chase after, or to set benchmarks of like, yes, this is where we would like to improve, or this is where we can afford to maintain. So yeah, though I'd say that from an assessment standpoint, again, from all those different areas, those are kind of like big picture how that information would get used, or like how conversations around that type of information generally would go.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like the nature of the sport complicates it in the sense of you need to be prepared for, say it's a championship match, like 25 minutes of work, or if it's a like just like a normal fight, right? 15 minutes of work, and that's a lot of movement, energy, damage, and output. So I can imagine they're kind of operating at the edges, and then you take into consideration all the fueling and the fueling requirements, the cutting strategies, managing all that, the stress of it, right? The build up, the actual fight itself. It seems like it's a really delicate situation, and I don't know how you feel about that, but when you talk about it being like this integrative, multidisciplinary project, that's exactly how it feels. So I can imagine having someone to coordinate that, and someone like yourself kind of in a role to help manage it. That would be kind of critical.
Yeah, I think especially in the UFC and also within baseball, like two of the most, if not the most, like skill dependent sports out there, in different ways for each of them, obviously. Um, but because the skill element is so critical to success, you have to prioritize the actual skills training. Like the cliche, you need to keep the main thing the main thing. Like from a integrative support standpoint, it's more often than not, how can we integrate and coordinate these other elements to ensure that they're able to get the most out of their skills training? So one, making sure that they're available to do their skills training, but to do it at the highest quality with the highest level of intent, or with the highest likelihood for skill acquisition or retention or what have you. And so I think that's really important to remember as well. Like all of these things are done in support of whatever sport the athlete is competing in. And so that's where I think, looking back, being involved in those conversations, in those roundtable meetings with the athletes and their coaches at the UFC, like that was so freaking cool, to be able to have that level of integration
Mm.
across the board. And it's something that I think is really fun and interesting, the organizations that I've been fortunate to be part of within baseball, of, having those same types of conversations within this realm, with the coaching staff, or with the player development staff, alongside any of the health and performance disciplines, or domains. Um, I think it's a function that at the UFC, like we had that formal role that I occupied. At other organizations where you don't necessarily have like a performance manager, performance director, where I think sports science oftentimes can fill that functionality of being that
Mm.
connector, of driving that unified conversation between different groups. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and then I guess one last thing about the UFC, in that because it's such a physical sport, I imagine there are like, I don't know if there are huge swings, but there's probably a lot of fatigue incurred by training, especially the diversity of the training that has to be done, the amounts, and then the nature of it. And then you kind of mentioned baseball too, right? There's probably a lot of work, physical work done by baseball players, given that they play so much, or their seasons are so extensive, and they have so many games. And then bleeding down from games, it's practices, and then it's strength and conditioning sessions. So there's just like a lot of input, and then there's a lot of output. So I kind of wonder if you ever got like an inside look or a feel for what that's like about the amount of like physical training, sport stress the athlete has to incur, and then kind of how they process it and deal with it, because it does feel like this kind of and almost like razor's edge of they're doing a lot of work and the fights are a lot and sparring's a lot. And then you're trying to manage that along with making whatever they're doing during camp productive.
Yeah, it's a delicate conversation. Because like I was saying, like on the one hand, you want to ensure that you're maximizing their availability to train, um, but you also want to make sure that they're making good use of their time in all areas. And at the end of the day, like it's not your call how they choose to spend their time. Um, but that's where I think, from a sports science standpoint, it's so useful to have a good physiology background, um, to be able to understand the effects,
Mm.
that all of these different inputs may have and how they might interact with each other. Because you're absolutely right, like it's a ton. And even just from a scheduling standpoint, if you're looking at MMA and thinking about like how many different practice sessions might somebody have in a single day. If they have striking in the morning, then they have wrestling, before lunch, and then they come do their S&C work, and then afterward they have, a night session where they're, doing their jujitsu, or maybe they teach a class or something. Like they're on all the time. And so, um, you know, that whole uh, that whole integration and vertical integration, if you will, of all the different elements, like it's so critical. And
Mm.
to be able to have awareness of what those elements are so that you can try to piece together the puzzle of how those things interact. Um, and then, one of the, I think it's talked about a lot, and it's one of those that you don't really, it's hard to fully appreciate until you're in that situation of like the soft skills of
Mhm.
being able to communicate with all of these different stakeholders and to get them all aligned. If they're not, um, like that's really difficult and it's really challenging. And it's not always because people aren't open to the conversations. A lot of times it's challenging because you're not all in the same place at the same time. You're not all operating on the same schedule. Um, there are so many different reasons why those types of conversations are challenging. Um, and I think it's a cop out if people like just point straight toward like personalities and
Mm.
communication styles and whatnot. Um, but again, that's where I think, going back to one of the potential functions of a sports scientist or a sports science department, as far as being that integrator across disciplines, um, of being able to also have the soft skills to navigate those individual conversations or those group conversations.
Yeah. And before we talk about how you kind of turned all of this expertise and background into working with the Reds, which you do now, what was your favorite memory or one of your favorite memories from you working at the UFCPI?
Um, the fighters as a whole, like in terms of athlete population, like they're just a fun group to work with, and not just because like they're interesting characters or whatnot, but they're some of the most humble and appreciative individuals that I've encountered. Like their work ethic is like unquestionable. Their desire to get better is like it's unmatched. Um, they put in the work and they're willing to put in the work. And like I said, they're just super appreciative of, your willingness to support them. A lot of them, you think about the world of MMA and the backgrounds of a lot of these fighters, um, coming from pretty humble beginnings. A lot of them, uh, I think that just brings a different mentality that you don't always encounter. And so I think that's probably one of the best, just like the people that you got to work with. Um, yeah.
That's awesome. Cool. And then you turn that into another position in baseball with the Reds. What was so? you had to make the transition from leaving the UFC and then accepting another position. What was the thought process of, okay, I'm moving from this organization to this one? Here are the possibilities or potentialities of this uh, new profession or new career trajectory. Here's what I want to do. And then you can kind of update us of like, oh, where are you at now? And then where are you going?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a hard decision to take this role with the Reds. Uh, like I mentioned, the opportunity to go back to the UFC full time, and in that role, especially that I ended up going back to the UFC for to work with Duncan so closely on, like that was like a career dream come true, like to be able to have that close of direct mentorship, working alongside Duncan, and had no intention of like wasn't really looking for any other opportunity. The Reds opportunity just, like I said, came knocking on my door, and what appealed to me about the opportunity at the Reds, one from a leadership standpoint, offered a lot in terms of being able to lead a department of sports science. Um, I came into a situation where we had, or we currently have, including myself, 5 full-time roles. Next year, we're adding another full-time role.
Wow.
We have probably another half dozen or so part-time or seasonal roles, including our internships. So, like, we have a pretty big department of like 12 to 15 people, depending on the time of the year. So that was really exciting to like be able to orchestrate that. We talked a lot before about like integrating and orchestrating like the training process and getting all of these different elements to work together. So from a leadership standpoint, to do that for a department was something that was really intriguing to me. And then with the Reds specifically, I had a lot of conversations with um, Jeff Head, who hired me into the role, about kind of the vision for, health and performance at the Reds, for sports science at the Reds, and um, other leaders within the organization as far as like what they're wanting to accomplish. And it was just an opportunity that had a lot of potential for just growth and trying to like establish like what is our approach to sports science, or utilizing sports science, whether that's on the training and health and performance side, or whether that's on the biomechanics side. Like it was just a blank slate to come in and like try to develop a sports science program that operates across the entire organization, and not just within health and performance, and not just within coaching, but the opportunities to integrate with the scouting department, to integrate with our analytics department, and like just non not just like physical preparation applications of like sports science. So just a way to like expand my conception of like what sports science could be, or how sports science could impact an organization. So yeah, it was a great move to, great opportunity to come over here for that. And I think that, we've been successful in laying the groundwork, and, we've had some good progress and results that have continued to, you know, gain support from our, coaches and practitioners and our leadership. Um, and I think we're in a good spot to do some pretty cool things. Like there's a lot of um, cool initiatives that we've been able to get off the ground, and that I think are indicative of the growth that the organization is willing to um, invest in. One being, we just posted, um, or the university just posted, uh, a partnership. We're partnering with the University of Bath to co-fund an industry-embedded PhD in biomechanics, looking at musculoskeletal modeling. And like that industry-embedded PhD model is something that's really common in the UK. It's something that is starting to pop up over here in the States. I know the Washington Spirit, women's soccer organization, they've kind of opened up a few of these types of roles, looking at some different problems and projects in their organization. So excited to kind of lead the charge for that here with baseball. Yeah, so just things like that where you get to really push the boundaries and explore uncharted territory.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Do you feel like this is kind of I mean, it sounds like something unique to the Reds, but is this a trend that we're going to start seeing, or do you think this is something that uh, Major League Baseball as a whole is going to start kind of investing in individually, or organization to organization? Because currently it seems like it's kind of all over the place with practices and responsibilities for sports scientists or departments, especially depending on the level, if it's collegiate or professional or private. But is this something that you think MLB as a whole is moving toward, or is this something kind of unique to your space so far?
Um, I haven't seen anything publicly before about an industry embedded PhD within Major League Baseball or with any specific clubs. Um, that doesn't mean it hasn't happened before, but I would be surprised if you don't see this more often. I think it's only a matter of time before um, people really look for these opportunities to leverage like these types of partnerships because like they add tremendous value on both sides. And um, yeah, I would be surprised if these don't start to pop up more, not just in baseball, but even in the NFL and in the
Mm.
NBA and you know MSL, any of the major leagues. Like it being on my side of things and like understanding our motivation for pursuing it, I don't see why others wouldn't also want to pursue it. So yeah, it's just a matter of getting support from your organization to do it, which we've been fortunate to have.
Yeah, and as someone looking at or thinking about what you've spoken about during this conversation, what you've been able to do, the people you've worked with, and the spaces you've kind of been able to put yourself in and been brought into, I think a lot of people listening are thinking like, well, I'd love to work with the Reds or a major league organization or the UFC or professional org. Um, love to work with a collegiate team. People just want to be in athletics. And I think a lot of people listening to the podcast, they're intellectually driven, curiosity driven. They're kind of the outliers that I think we are, and we kind of live on that periphery. And I think the listeners are as well. And I always like to try to provide some practical or some perspective of like, oh, if you were to do it, how would that be able to be done? So for people listening who are interested in kind of pursuing a similar path, what advice do you have to them that you would kind of hand off based on your experiences and what you've learned to help them kind of reach, their professional or career destinations?
That's a good question. I think first and foremost, you have to have the right motivation. Like I didn't pursue the UFC or wanted to work in Olympic sports or you know my jobs in baseball for the clout. Like don't be a clout chaser. I'll be lying if I said that like there wasn't some level of vanity to it. Like working for a professional organization is cool. Um, Having the jobs and titles that I've had is cool. It's something that I'm proud of, but those weren't
Mm.
the like primary reason for doing it. I could work in any sport and be excited as long as the environment was one in which everybody was trying to be the best that they wanted to be. Like winning, like it's just being a competitor like is such a big driver. And so as long as you're in an environment that allows you to kind of manifest that. Like that's what motivates me. Like it's not necessarily what has to motivate everybody else, but I think seeing the people that I would say are successful, or that I look up to, and value like their experience and advice and mentorship and all that sort of stuff. Like it's being obsessed with doing good work,
Mm.
regardless of where you are, regardless of, who you're working with or who you're working for. Um, Gaining a deep level of knowledge, and understanding to allow you to transfer your skills across a variety of different applications or sports. And like I said earlier, I wasn't an MMA guy before. I wasn't a baseball guy before. Not sure if I've shared on your podcast in the other two episodes, but prior to my job with the Giants, like I don't think I had cumulatively in my entire life watched 9 innings of baseball. Right. So like I was very much and still I wouldn't say I'm a baseball guy. Like I'm learning every day more and more about the game. Um, but it's that ability to like go through your experiences, understand how they apply across, different scenarios or environments or contexts, being able to communicate and articulate that to others. Like if you're trying to move into a new space, um, like had I not been able to, demonstrate how the skills I learned, coaching weightlifting and only weightlifting,
Mm.
or running athlete monitoring for weightlifting, how that applied or could be valuable or prepared me to adequately be the S&C intern at the UFC, like I wouldn't have gotten the role. Um, had I not been able to translate how my experience, with talent ID and running a monitoring program and the thoughts around long-term athlete development and how that might fit into the world of baseball, probably wouldn't have gotten the Giants role.
Mm.
So it's like being able to think laterally, um, and what you have to have both feet in as well. I think that's part of it. That doesn't mean just taking any opportunity that comes to you. From our own family situation during the PhD, had a wife. I still have a wife. Still married with 3 kids. Um, and so internship opportunities, like, couldn't just take any internship. I was very specifically looking for paid internships
Mm.
because otherwise it just financially wouldn't have been, viable for our situation. And like I said, a lot of luck and timing and a lot of other things, was successful in being able to get the internship at the UFC. Whereas others, maybe you do have the ability to take an unpaid internship, maybe you don't, but you got to be able to, understand realistically, like what are the different opportunities available, what's the realistic, you know, for your situation, and to pursue those. So, um, yeah.
I think it's motivating, but it's really exciting kind of hearing you talk and also thinking about, my background. And again, the reason why I kind of bring up the listener base is because they have very similar backgrounds. Like everyone who listens is probably in weightlifting. Everyone who listens is probably obsessed with training theory and performance. And I think most of it is bound by weightlifting, like bound by the sport of weightlifting. But I think we have a lot of people who also just think about training and performance broadly, kind of like I do. And it's like you just want to be involved with high performance, and you just want to see people do well, build like really meaningful relationships, and be able to contribute to that. And I think it's exciting for me to hear that. It's exciting for them, and I'm sure we're probably gonna have a lot of people who reach out or listen to this episode. Um, and if they do want to ask questions or kind of inquire further or maybe discuss, the internships that you guys have, where can they go to contact you for all that stuff?
Yeah. Social media, I'm most active on Twitter and LinkedIn. My handle is Aaron J. Cunanan. That's for both. So you can just search. Um, on either of those platforms and connect with me. Do my best to respond in a timely manner, but that's not always the case. But I will do my best to respond. I try really hard. Like you said, just knowing like my background and, kind of journey. I think it's important to like remember that I was once in those people's places and try to give back and offer any advice or support that I can.
Awesome. Yeah, and for everyone listening, if you guys enjoyed the episode, let me know. Obviously, love having Aaron on the podcast, and would love to have him on future episodes and talk more about what he's doing and kind of the realization of like this career path. Because I think I get into it, a lot of people get into it, and you're like, I love sport physiology, I love training theory, I love all these things. This seems to make the sense for the next logical step. You don't actually know what's going to happen when you do it. So it's kind of this like black box basically. And that's kind of where I'm at. And I think that's where, a lot of people in the space will be. So if you guys enjoy the podcast, let me know. If you do, share it around, give the show 5 stars and support us. And we'll make sure to return the favor. So guys, thanks for listening to the podcast, and we will catch you all next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.